Michael Brennan's descent into darkness at Whispering Pines Motel begins with a desperate search for a job. After blowing the whistle on shady practices at his tech company, he lost his livelihood, was blacklisted, and found himself fighting off eviction. So, when he saw the unusual job listing for a night receptionist at Whispering Pines Motel, offering an incredible $50 per hour, he couldn't resist. The motel itself sits on a lonely stretch of road outside Fayetteville, WV, surrounded by thick, ominous woods that always seem cloaked in mist, no matter the time of day. The interview is brief, almost too easy, with Mr. Thorne, a towering man with a stone-cold expression and a strange gleam in his eye. Thorne barely asks Michael any questions, instead just explaining that he'll be alone each night and that his duties are simple. Check guests in, ensure the lobby is clean, and never under any circumstances leave the front desk between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Michael's first shift begins quietly enough. The motel is eerily empty, with only the occasional hum of the vending machine to keep him company. But around midnight, strange things start to happen. The motel's lights flicker, and he hears whispers drifting from the hallway leading to the guest rooms, though the register shows no one is checked in. At 1:30 a.m., Michael glances down the hallway, only to catch sight of a shadowy figure gliding from room to room, vanishing as soon as he dares to look closer. He thinks about calling Mr. Thorne, but remembers the rules. And then, as the clock strikes 2 a.m., a bone-chilling sensation fills the air. The lights go out entirely, and Michael is plunged into a darkness so complete he can barely see his hand in front of his face. Suddenly, a soft tapping sound begins first on the front desk, then moving to the doors and windows. He grips his chair tightly, reminding himself of Mr. Thorne's warning to stay put. The tapping grows louder, turning into frantic pounding, coming from all directions at once. Michael's heart pounds, but he's paralyzed with fear. In his periphery, he sees the outline of a figure in one of the windows, staring in at him. Its face is obscured by shadows, but its eyes glow faintly, watching his every move. As the clock hits 4 a.m., the sounds stop, and the lights flicker back on. The lobby looks normal again, but Michael can't shake the feeling that he's not alone. He completes his shift, shaken and exhausted, and goes home, swearing he won't return. Yet, a strange compulsion brings him back the next night. Each shift grows more disturbing as he begins to see ghostly figures, hear laughter echoing through empty hallways, and find ominous messages scratched into the walls. The few guests who do check in act strangely. They speak in hushed voices, avoid eye contact, and leave by morning without a trace. One evening, Michael tries to question one of them, a pale woman with vacant eyes, but she merely smiles and whispers, "We're all just passing through." Over time, Michael notices changes in himself. He feels watched even when he's alone, and sometimes he hears whispers calling his name, urging him to venture down the hallway he's forbidden to explore. One night, unable to resist, he steps away from the front desk at 3:15 a.m. to investigate a particularly disturbing sound. As he nears the end of the hall, he feels a cold hand brush his shoulder, and a chilling voice whispers, "You've seen too much." Michael bolts back to the desk, but the hallways stretch and twist behind him, as if trapping him in a maze of endless doors. Just as he thinks he's lost forever, the clock strikes 4 a.m., and he finds himself back at the front desk, heart racing. One evening, as Michael contemplates quitting, Mr. Thorne appears out of nowhere, his face grim and knowing. "You're starting to understand the rules," he says. "But remember, some truths are better left alone." Just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the highway, I rolled into Phil, a nearly forgotten town clinging to the past. Whispering Pines Motel came into view, a decaying relic of the 1960s, crouched at the edge of the town like an old, faded photograph. The building stretched in a sagging L shape, its 2 stories crumbling slightly as if they could collapse any moment. Rooms lined a poorly lit parking lot pockmarked with potholes, and the once bright neon sign blinked unevenly. Half the letters burnt out while the rest buzzed and flickered as though reluctant to stay lit. The motel's facade had the kind of peeling paint that signaled decades of neglect, and every detail seemed to add to its ominous charm. A pair of flickering streetlights cast murky yellow beams across the gravel, and an old pickup truck, its paint flaking, sat abandoned near the entrance. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should turn around, but desperation won out, as it had been doing a lot lately. Inside, the motel office was a cramped, dimly lit box, smelling of stale cigarettes, mold, and industrial cleaner. The worn carpet seemed to swallow the faint light spilling from an overhead fixture, which buzzed and flickered much like the neon sign outside. Behind the desk sat a man who looked as old as the building itself, his face lost in a web of wrinkles. He peered down at a yellowed newspaper, flipping a page with shaky hands. He didn't even look up as I approached. I cleared my throat. I'm Michael Brennan. I called about the night shift job." The man barely moved, just lowered his newspaper enough to reveal eyes as cold and gray as steel. He studied me for an uncomfortable moment, his gaze piercing as though he could see right through me. "You sure you want it?" His voice rasped like metal scraping over concrete. "Yes, good," he grunted. "You start tonight, 11 to 7, $50 an hour. Cash. Any questions?" I blinked, stunned. "You don't need to interview me or check references?" He let out a dry chuckle that barely qualified as laughter. "You showed up. That's the interview." He leaned forward, his expression growing darker. "Job ain't for everyone." A shiver prickled down my spine, but I pushed it aside, masking it with a nod. "What do I need to do?" The old man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. "Memorize these rules. Don't write them down. Don't tell anyone about them. Break a rule, and you're done." "Got it." Before I could respond, he shoved the paper into my hand, grabbed his coat, and shuffled out of the room, leaving me standing alone in the dim, silent office. As the door creaked shut behind him, the weight of the situation settled heavily on my shoulders. I took a shaky breath and unfolded the paper. Written in an uneven scrawl were the rules. At 11:15 p.m., turn off the neon sign. Turn it back on at 6:45 a.m. sharp, not a minute earlier or later. If you hear knocking from the ice machine, ignore it. Do not open the ice machine between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. Room 237 is always vacant. If anyone asks about it, say it's under renovation. If you see lights on in room 237, do not investigate. The office phone will ring at 3:33 a.m. Answer it, but do not speak. Listen for exactly 66 seconds, then hang up. If a guest checks in and gives the name John Smith, give them the key to room 113, regardless of availability. Do not look at their face. The vending machine may dispense items that aren't food or drinks. If it does, dispose of them immediately and do not touch them with your bare hands. At 5:55 a.m., lock yourself in the supply closet for exactly 5 minutes. Do not come out early, no matter what you hear. Each line seemed stranger than the last, a list of precautions so bizarre I couldn't tell if it was some twisted joke or a serious list of instructions. But something in the old man's eyes, or maybe the oppressive silence hanging around the motel, told me to take the rules seriously. As I settled into the creaky chair behind the front desk of the Whispering Pines Motel, an uneasy feeling crept over me. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, casting an unsettling red glow through the cracked blinds, but I could barely take my eyes off the clock. I checked it obsessively, watching the seconds crawl toward 11:15. When the time finally came, my heart was already pounding. Following the rules the old man had given me, I went outside into the cold night air and flipped the switch for the neon sign. The motel lot was plunged into near darkness, with only the dim amber glow of a few outdated floodlights illuminating the cracked pavement and half-dead shrubs. I felt an odd sense of isolation, as though I had crossed a threshold and was no longer part of the normal world. As I turned to go back inside, a flicker of movement caught my eye near room 237. I froze, squinting into the shadows. The room was supposed to be empty, under renovation, or at least that's what the old man had said. I could have sworn I saw something darting across the window, a quick, shadowy figure that disappeared the moment I focused on it. My stomach twisted, but when I looked again, there was nothing there. Just the still, empty silence of the night. I shook it off, convincing myself it was a trick of the light or my mind playing games with me, and headed back inside. The hours dragged by in silence. Around 1:30, a car finally pulled into the lot, its headlights slicing through the darkness. I watched as a young couple stumbled out, clinging to each other, giggling and shushing each other as they made their way to the front door. The guy had a sloppy grin, and the girl's laughter was shrill and uncontrolled, echoing off the walls. I forced a smile as they approached the desk, trying to appear calm and unaffected. "Welcome to Whispering Pines," I said, doing my best to sound friendly. "How can I help you?" The guy leaned against the counter, his breath heavy with the smell of beer. "We need a room," he said, slurring his words slightly. He shot his girlfriend a wink. "Something with a view." I glanced around, trying to ignore the sense of dread building up inside me, and handed them a key. They took it and wandered down the dim hallway, their laughter fading into the distance. I exhaled, feeling a strange relief wash over me. Maybe this jobs wouldn't be so bad after all, I thought. It was around 2:17 a.m. when the sound started a soft, persistent thumping in the lobby. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. The ice machine, sitting silently in the corner, seemed to be the source of the noise. The sound was almost polite at first, like someone knocking gently, as if waiting for permission to come in. But it grew louder, more insistent, as if something or someone was trapped inside, clawing to get out. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the rule. Do not open the ice machine between 2 and 4 My eyes stayed fixed on the machine as the noise escalated into a frantic scraping, a desperate clawing that set my teeth on edge. I pressed my hands over my ears, trying to drown it out, but the noise seemed to seep through, burrowing into my mind, each scrape more frantic than the last. My mind raced with images of trapped creatures, hands pressing against metal from the inside, nails snapping as they tried to claw their way out. I clenched my jaw, muttering under my breath, "It's not real. It's not real." Finally, as abruptly as it had started, the noise stopped, leaving the room deathly silent. I stood there for a few moments, feeling my heart thud painfully in my chest, waiting for any other sounds to break the silence. But nothing came. Just silence, pressing in around me like a heavy, invisible weight. At exactly 3:33 a.m., the phone on the desk rang, its shrill tone slicing through the quiet. I jumped, then remembered the rule. Answer the phone, but do not speak. I picked it up, holding the receiver to my ear with a trembling hand. At first, all I heard was static, a faint crackling that sounded distant, almost underwater. But slowly, buried beneath the static, I began to hear something else, a faint, rhythmic thumping, like footsteps on old, creaky floorboards. Then, a door creaking open, and a soft, labored breathing. My pulse quickened. The sounds grew louder, more distinct, as though someone were drawing closer. And then, clear as day, a voice whispered through the line, low and menacing. "We've been waiting for you, Michael." My breath caught in my throat, and my hand shook. How did they know my name? I slammed the phone down, heart racing, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. For a moment, I considered running, leaving the motel behind and never looking back. But the thought of my empty bank account and the consequences of breaking the rules held me in place. I stumbled to the bathroom, desperate to shake off the feeling of dread clinging to me. Splashing cold water on my face, I tried to steady my breathing. But as I looked up, my heart nearly stopped. Written across the fogged-up mirror were two words. "Remember, Michael." The words were smeared, dripping down the glass as if they'd been scratched in with trembling hands. But the strangest part was, there was no steam, no reason for the mirror to fog up in the first place. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, the words lingering like a warning I couldn't understand. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. At 4:30, the lobby door creaked open, and a man stepped inside. He was tall, dressed in a long black coat that looked worn and dusty. His head was tilted down, casting his face in shadow, and I couldn't make out his features. He approached the desk with slow, deliberate steps, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were hidden behind dark sunglasses. "I need a room," he said, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. I swallowed hard. "Name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He paused for a moment, then answered, "John Smith." My heart skipped a beat as I remembered the rule. If a guest checks in under the name John Smith, give them room 113 and do not look at their face. Without another word, I grabbed the key to room 113 and handed it to him, keeping my gaze fixed on the floor. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of his reflection in the lobby window, a blank, featureless face, smooth as porcelain, with no eyes, nose, or mouth. I squeezed my eyes shut, heart hammering, and when I opened them, he was gone. At 5:55, the last rule echoed in my mind. Lock yourself in the supply closet for 5 minutes. Do not come out early, no matter what you hear. I rushed to the closet, closed the door, and locked it, clutching the doorknob with both hands. Seconds later, I heard footsteps just outside, slow and deliberate, growing closer until they stopped right outside the door. Something heavy slammed against it, and the handle rattled violently, as if someone or something was trying to break in. My pulse pounded in my ears as I pressed myself against the wall, listening to the door shake under the force of each hit. But just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the banging had been, filled with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. At exactly 6 o'clock, I unlocked the door and stepped out, feeling as though I'd just escaped some unspeakable nightmare. The hallway was empty, the motel silent once again. I walked outside and turned the neon sign back on at 6:45, watching as the red glow flickered back to life, illuminating the lot. I stood there until the sun began to rise, filling the sky with pale light, washing away the shadows that had haunted the night. At 7 o'clock sharp, the old man returned. He looked me over, his expression unreadable. "Want to quit?" he asked, his voice as flat and gruff as ever, but with a hint of something almost like respect. I opened my mouth to say yes, to walk away and leave this nightmare behind. But the image of my empty wallet flashed in my mind. "I'll be back tonight," I replied, the words leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. The drive home was a blur. As soon as I walked through my apartment door, I collapsed onto my bed, exhausted. But even in sleep, I couldn't escape the motel. My dreams were filled with whispering shadows, faceless men, and rooms that didn't exist. And as the clock struck 11 o'clock the next night, I found myself driving back to Whispering Pines, bracing for whatever horrors awaited me. The next night, when I returned to Whispering Pines, the old man was already there. He was standing by the desk, waiting for me, with a look that seemed even more exhausted than before, like he'd been carrying the motel's burdens alone for far too long. Without a word, he held out another piece of paper, a new rule scribbled hastily in jagged handwriting. "If you see a little girl in a white dress, do not let her in, no matter what she says." I took the paper, reading it over twice, feeling the weight of each word sink into my mind. "Who is she?" I asked, voice low. "Doesn't matter who she is," he replied flatly. "Just follow the rule." Before I could press him for more information, he left, leaving only silence in his wake. By the time I'd settled in, it was 11 p.m. sharp. I checked each of the previous night's rules in my mind, my eyes darting toward the clock every few minutes, like a prisoner awaiting the hour of release. At 11:15, I went outside to turn off the neon sign, trying not to look too long at the shadows pooling in the parking lot. When the sign flickered off, it cast the motel into a thicker darkness, one that seemed to breathe on its own. I shivered as I stepped back into the lobby, locking the door behind me with a trembling hand. By 1 a.m., the motel was silent, its old pipes groaning occasionally like they were alive, like the whole building was watching, waiting. At 2:03, the knocking began. This time, it wasn't just soft rapping. It sounded urgent, desperate, as though something inside the machine was growing more frantic by the second. I sat at the front desk, my body frozen as each knock reverberated through the empty lobby. It was louder than the night before, each knock more insistent, clawing at my composure. The knocking stopped suddenly, but before I could even breathe a sigh of relief, a new noise filled the silence, a faint scratching, like nails scraping against metal from within the ice machine. I bit my lip, glancing at the old clock ticking slowly on the wall, wishing time would move faster. Then, at 2:47, the scratching stopped, replaced by a faint whisper that I could just barely hear over the hum of the vending machine. "Michael." My blood ran cold. I clamped my hands over my ears, shaking my head, muttering under my breath, "This isn't real. It can't be real." But the whisper continued, soft and sinister, winding through my mind like a dark lullaby. "Michael, please, let me out." The clock finally struck 3 a.m., and the whisper faded, leaving only the sound of my own shallow breaths. I stayed glued to my chair, staring at the ice machine, half expecting it to lurch open, spilling whatever nightmare was inside. But it remained closed, silent and still. When the phone rang at 3:33, I picked it up with a trembling hand. Just like the night before, I didn't speak, only listened. The static on the other end was thick, suffocating, like a wall of white noise designed to drown out any coherent thought. But beneath it, I could hear something. A woman's voice, faint, whispering my name. "Michael, do you remember?" A flash of something dark flitted through my mind, a memory I couldn't quite grasp. The static grew louder, her voice more insistent. "Remember, Michael." The line went dead. I hung up slowly, my mind spinning, fighting to latch onto the fleeting memory. But it was gone, buried beneath layers of fog and fear. At 5:15, I was starting to relax, convincing myself that I'd survived another night. But then, a shadow moved outside the window. A child stood in the dim light, her white dress flowing around her like mist. She was young, maybe 6 or 7, with long dark hair that hung down in wet strands over her shoulders. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the darkness, and her wide eyes glowed faintly as she looked up at me. I froze, the old man's warning ringing in my mind. Do not let her in, no matter what she says. She lifted a small hand, tapping gently on the glass, her expression pleading. I glanced away, pretending not to see her, my heart pounding as she knocked again. Please. Her voice was soft, fragile, like a child lost in the woods. Please, mister. I need help. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to open the door. But the longer I ignored her, the more desperate her voice became. Please, she whimpered, her voice wavering with a sob. They left me here, all alone. I don't know where to go. A wave of guilt washed over me, gnawing at my resolve. But as I glanced back at her, something about her eyes froze me in place. They weren't the eyes of a frightened child. They were dark, empty, like twin voids that seemed to devour the light. Please, she whispered, her lips curling into a faint smile. I just need to come in for a little while. The desperation in her voice grew into something darker, her tone twisting into a soft, menacing hiss. Michael, let me in. My name on her lips sent a jolt of terror through me. I backed away from the window, retreating to the safety of the supply closet. But even as I locked the door behind me, I could still hear her voice, whispering my name, begging to be let inside. I watched the seconds tick by on my phone, counting down to 5:55. As the time approached, my fear mounted, every shadow in the room seeming to stretch and bend toward me. When the clock struck 5:55, I locked myself in the supply closet, shutting the door tightly and pressing myself against the back wall. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the pounding began. Heavy footsteps thundered down the hallway outside, stopping just outside the closet. A guttural growl echoed through the door, low and menacing, like a wild animal prowling the empty motel. I held my breath, feeling the air grow thick with the scent of something rotting, something dark and ancient. The footsteps resumed, moving slowly down the hallway, each step a haunting reminder of whatever nightmare roamed the motel. Then came the scratching. Nails dragged along the closet door, slow and deliberate, as though savoring the terror that pulsed through me. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying for the noises to stop. But the scratching grew louder, more frenzied, until it felt like the door would splinter under the force. Just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence filled the closet, broken only by the sound of my own shallow breaths. At exactly 6 datum, I stumbled out of the supply closet, my legs trembling as I leaned against the wall for support. The motel was quiet, bathed in the pale glow of dawn, and the shadows that had lurked in every corner seemed to retreat into the walls. I went outside and turned on the neon sign at 6:45, watching as it flickered back to life. The parking lot was empty, and the little girl was gone, leaving no trace of her presence. The old man arrived at 7, his expression unreadable as he looked me over. "You're still here," he said, sounding almost impressed. "Who? Who is she?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. He shrugged. "Someone who doesn't belong here, like the others." "Others?" He didn't answer, only handed me another piece of paper with a new rule scrawled across it in hasty, angry letters. If you hear laughter coming from room 237, leave immediately. I stared at him, my mind racing with questions. But he only gave me a look that made it clear I wasn't getting any answers. I drove home in a daze, my mind replaying the little girl's voice, the sound of her pleading, her laughter, the scratching at the closet door. I was trapped in a nightmare that seemed to have no end, and each new rule only tightened the grip Whispering Pines held over me. As I write this, I wonder how long I can survive the nights here. Or, more disturbingly, if I'm somehow connected to this place, if the motel remembers me, somehow, calling me back to a past I can't remember. But there's one thing I know for certain. There's something in the darkness, waiting for me to slip up, waiting for me to break just one rule.